So speaking of the calendar, we are still in the Hebrew month of Adar, just a few short days since the festival of Purim, when we read the Megillah and we reminded ourselves about the heroism and the vision and bravery of Queen Esther, who saved her people by making space for herself and flexing her muscle in ancient Persia, a place where there was no precedent for women's voices being heard in the halls of government. So in that spirit and in the name and the memory of Queen Esther, I want to begin by sharing a story about another remarkable woman who made her voice heard and her presence known in male-dominated spaces of power and influence. When Ann Richards was governor of Texas, she talked frequently about having to shatter the same ceilings over and over and over again to overcome the barriers to women's participation in government at every level. She talked a lot about how important it was for her and for the generations of women in government who would follow her not to back down and to make sure, forcefully if necessary, that their voices would be heard in conversations that would affect them and their future. Governor Richards used to use a phrase that I think about often and frequently these days. She used to say, if you're not at the table, you're on the menu. She was talking about the same plain reality that Esther came to know all too well when she assumed her role as Queen of Persia. When it comes to questions of power, when it comes to decision-making, things get decided and outcomes are determined just as much by the absence of those who aren't in the room as by the presence of those who showed up to participate. When it comes to discussions and deliberations about who will reap the rewards and who will pay the costs when the future is decided, the people left out of those conversations very often find themselves and their interests being carved up by those who did have a seat at the table. So in that spirit, and in the name of Queen Esther and Governor Richards, may they both rest in peace, I want to talk to you tonight about getting involved in an election. This is the election that around here we've been calling the most important election you've never heard of. The elections for the World Zionist Congress that are open now and will remain open for the next 6 weeks. So what is the World Zionist Congress? I'm very happy you asked. In case you missed the table out front in the lobby that was manned by our election captain, Stephen Proler, or somehow overlooked the brilliant and insightful cover article on this month's bulletin that I wrote, the World Zionist Congress is the democratically elected body that represents the Jewish people all over the world. This was the same organization that was founded in the late 19th century by Theodor Herzl, the founder of modern Zionism, and the organization is still thriving, still functioning today, known as the Parliament of the Jewish People. And the way that this parliament selects its representatives is through elections that are held every 5 years. So every year that's divisible by 5, Jews from all over the world cast their votes for one of a number of different slates whose representatives will shape the direction of major Israeli institutions and help direct over $1 billion in funding within the Jewish state. In order to be eligible to vote, you just have to be 18 years old. Elliot and Sabrina, sorry, you can't vote in this one, but you'll vote in the 2030 election. You need to be 18 years old, you have to identify as Jewish, and you need to pay $5 for a processing fee that goes toward the administration of the election itself. That is it. By voting in this election every 5 years, those of us who live here outside of Israel are able to have our voice heard in some of the most major decisions affecting the Jewish state. So this is especially important. If you've ever felt a sense of distance from Israel, if you ever worried that its policies and priorities are not an accurate reflection of your values, this is your way to play a part in remedying that. So when you go online to vote, you can explore a long list of slates that are competing in the election, and you can cast your vote for any one of them that's in keeping with your values and your conscience. It is my hope that all of us will take 5 minutes to cast a ballot and consider using our votes to support the reform slate. The way that you do that most easily and most efficiently is to go online to vote for reform. You can't do it now because your cell phones are off. You assured me at the beginning of the service. But after the service, you can turn on your phones, or after Shabbos, go online, go to Vote for Reform, vote the number 4, reform.org, voteforreform.org. Please do it soon. Please don't do it right now, but please do it soon so that your voice will be heard. So in addition to helping determine how funding is directed, these WZC elections also determine the allocations of board seats and leadership positions in the largest national institutions in Israel, the bodies that make significant and deeply consequential decisions that affect people's lives and the geopolitical currents within and beyond Israel's borders. One of those organizations is KKL, Keren Kayemet Yisrael, the Jewish National Fund of Israel, which controls a budget of more than $1 billion and owns roughly 13% of the land in Israel. That is a very significant role of influence in the Jewish state. And those are our assets. And the decisions about how the JNF should be governed and how its resources should be spent are determined by the votes being cast in this election. So right now, let me tell you where we are, thanks to the results of the last elections, the ones in 2020. The reform movement and those who are aligned with us hold a majority of seats on the KKL-JNF board in Israel. And it is a majority of 1. Okay? We hold a majority of 1 seat on that board, but that 1 seat is enough. Because we're at the table and because we've been there for the past 5 years, we've been able to make sure that adequate funding is being directed toward rebuilding projects in the Gaza envelope that were devastated on October 7th and in the communities of the north that have been suffering during the many months since then. And we can make sure that dollars are directed there toward community rebuilding and rehabilitation in those suffering communities rather than, for example, toward the expansion of settlements in the West Bank, as some other coalitions are advocating. Okay? So I want to tell you a brief story that happened recently about one particular proposal that came before that KKL-JNF board for funding. So you may know that in addition to its territorial and real estate holdings, the Jewish National Fund owns a lot of the national landmarks and memorials throughout the state of Israel. Recently, the board got a proposal for what seemed on its face to be a positive and relatively inconsequential request to restore a small memorial to fallen soldiers located in a small neighborhood of East Jerusalem called Sheikh Jarrah. If you follow news from Israel, you may be familiar with that name, Sheikh Jarrah, because Sheikh Jarrah has been a particularly volatile flashpoint of conflict between the Palestinian residents of East Jerusalem and the ultra-Orthodox Jews who are moving into that neighborhood in recent years. So when the board, again, controlled by a majority of 1 vote by us and our allies, when they took a closer look at the proposal, they saw that the plan wasn't just to clean up and replace a memorial plaque. It also included a stealth provision to build a large new amphitheater to seat hundreds of people, which could be used as a gathering place for ultra-nationalist rallies, and a tinderbox for tension and potentially violence and destabilization of that most politically fragile section of the Holy City. If that proposal went through, the repercussions of that project could reverberate far beyond Jerusalem and potentially trigger a new conflict in the region. So the moderate voices of that board were able to block that provision of the proposal, and the only reason they were able to catch it was because they were in the room where it happened. Because of the outcome of the 2020 World Zionist Congress election, because of our votes, representatives of our interests were there to read the fine print on a proposal that would have inflamed the entire nation and say, no, we're not going to let this happen. And because we had enough votes to hold the majority, even just by that slimmest margin of a single vote, the vote went our way and the proposal failed. Of course, if we didn't have the numbers, if we were to lose our majority vote, then the next dispute won't go our way, which is why it's so desperately important that all of us have our voices heard before elections close on May 4th. Our votes in this election are the way we ensure that the kinds of Jews and the kinds of Judaism we represent are supported in the state of Israel. That's how we see to it that support is directed to progressive charities and institutions, to programs that serve non-Orthodox Jews, interfaith families, LGBT Israelis, people converted or married under Reform auspices, those whose Jewish status is by no means guaranteed by the Knesset. Our ticket is the only one that will specifically provide support for reform institutions in Israel, reform rabbis, reform synagogues, and if you've ever sent a kid or been a kid at a Jewish summer camp, for the engaging Israel programming content and remarkable Israeli leaders who teach and inspire our kids at URJ camps across North America. So it's really important, it's really simple. You gotta be 18, you have to identify as Jewish, and you have to have $5 to pay the administrative fee. That is it. It will cost you $5 and 5 minutes when you go to voteforreform.org to cast your vote. The fact is that if we don't vote, other people will. And the voices that shape Israel's future won't be ours. That is the cold truth of politics, which is messy and volatile and resolutely unsentimental. The king of Persia, at the end of the Megillah, was moved to spare his kingdom's Jews, not because he suddenly became sympathetic to their cause, but because the right woman was in the right place at the right time. And the same can probably be said about the Texas governor's mansion in the early 90s. The right woman was in the right place at the right time. Both Governor Richards and Queen Esther knew that if they weren't at the table, they'd be on the menu. And then, just as now, I know which position I'd rather be in. And I hope you will join me at the table. Shabbat Shalom.